Hello, and thank you for joining us today for the second CREST webinar of the day on our IR webinar day. And this one is a look inside Nephilim by Dan Saunders at NTT. So we will get started in a few seconds. There's just a few more people coming into the room. So I will just give it a sort of 30 seconds for those people to just get on. Lovely. So once again, thank you very much for those that you just joined us and for those that were on earlier for joining us today for the second CREST webinar in the IR day of webinars today. And this webinar will be a look inside Nephilim by Dan Saunders at NTT, and I will be passing over to Dan in a few seconds. But just before that, just wanted to go through about any questions that you may have at the end of this presentation. So you do have the opportunity to ask Dan any questions that come up throughout. So please feel free to type into the question pane. You can do that throughout the presentation so that you don't forget anything that you wanted to ask. And if we see that sort of answered perhaps throughout the presentation, we'll always come to you to just say, you know, was that answered for you? And if not, you can put in any questions right at the end. And please feel free to do that or use the chat function so that we can get those asked of Dan. So now I am going to pass over to Dan to start his presentation. Thank you, Dan.
Terrific. Thanks, Debbie, for the introduction. Yep, so today we're going to be looking at a ransomware which has been doing the rounds in the past year in 2020 called Nefilim. And the focus really of this morning's kind of talk through and presentation is really around the current threat landscape associated to OCGs and the threat of ransomware. We're also going to explore the Nephilim TTPs that we've come across based on our incidents and what we know already. Looking at the key properties associated to the ransomware, how it operates, and then also looking at mitigation and lessons learned as well based on what we've seen on our engagements as well. So we'll be jumping through these various key topics and walking through exactly what we've encountered. And it's always good to share experiences based on these groups. So just pretty much to kick things off, fairly recently an interview was given the back end of December by a known Russian actor, if you like, and there were some interesting comments made around, you know, the current landscape around ransomware. And what was interesting about this interview was the views on utilizing ransomware for peaceful purposes, you know, in order to trigger a change in security policy and effectively improve security posture. So I don't think we typically see red teams going around deploying ransomware, etc. I think the first encounter organizations tend to get is either when they're a victim of the ransomwares or when tabletop exercises are being run. But it's a really interesting question because it kind of, you know, brings ransomware up in the light that it is one of those threats that really could cause the most significant damage to organizations, and 2020 has definitely been the year for ransomware, with new malware families emerging and old ones supposedly decommissioning. So what do we know about the kind of current threat landscape? Well, we know that the threat actors are evolving, they're developing new strategies, attack vectors and so on. And the extortion is also evolving. We've seen with some other ransomware groups, the likes of eGregor in the past year, that the actors are, you know, making telephone calls to victims and employees as well in order to, you know, apply additional pressure and try and extort the victims for significant sums of money. But their tactics and tools that they're using are also developing. That, you know, they're utilizing common tools, repackaging them, recustomizing them, and then deploying those in environments, you know, typically to enhance their ability, but also to avoid detection. We know that there's been significant changes in a shift in sector targeting as well. So ransomware groups typically, you know, every sector is at risk. However, there's a shift towards more kind of manufacturing type organization, manufacturing sectors and government sectors, because, you know, if ransomware hits the factories and stops materials being churned out, then, you know, that's a significant impact on the organization and the operational ability of those organizations. So if everything comes to a halt, the organization can't operate. So it kind of forces the hand of, well, if we can't, get systems back up and running, if we don't have sufficient backups and restore processes in place, then, you're going to be in a spot to bother. In terms of old vulnerabilities, so we know that old vulnerabilities are still persistently remaining an active target. They still exist. If you don't have the sufficient patch management processes in place, then these vulnerabilities are going to continuously be scanned, and it's only a matter of time if they're sitting there awaiting to be hit. So we are seeing time and time again old vulnerabilities remaining in situ, which are just waiting to be exploited by the attackers. So making sure you have that sufficient vulnerability management plan in place will really benefit you. So when we look at the kind of current threat modeling that we're seeing, we know that every organization has their different types of assets, or we refer to them as crown jewels, if you like. These are the things that the attackers want to get to, or what their main goals are for their attack phase. And often these also lead to additional targets as well. So it may be that the organization is used as a stepping stone to reach their intended goal. The severity of the instance really depending on the confidentiality and integrity of the data and what's being targeted. So if it's sensitive data that's being exploited, then the severity of the instance is going to rise fairly significant. And in terms of how the attackers are actually getting onto the systems as well, they're developing threats, working with other threat actors, but also leveraging and developing exploits which are being utilized as well. This coupled with vulnerabilities that are present on systems as well, it really makes for a fairly scary landscape, if you like, because we need to then be familiar with assets that are in place within our environment, what vulnerabilities and risks that they may pose, and then also we have to assess the current kind of security safeguards that are in place, whether this is your intrusion detection systems, antivirus, EDR solutions, etc., and how these can detect either the exploits and threats that are being utilized, but also detecting system vulnerabilities. And that's where frameworks such as, for example, MITRE ATT&CK comes into play. So that's a kind of overview of the kind of current threat landscape that we're dealing with and what we all need to be aware of. So let's look into one of the ransomware groups in terms of Nephilim. So we know that Nephilim pretty much started on the ladder at the start of 2020. They've been fairly consistent with their attacks, not as dominant as the likes of Rogue, but we know that the attacks that they have been performing have been on pretty significant and large targets from a range of different sectors as well. There has been kind of wide reports of close links to NTT based on similarities in code within the ransomware P binary itself, which we've also observed. So whether there is relationships in place there from previous ransomware groups, which is fairly common from when one ransomware group decommissions, another may take the code, or it may even be the same actors slightly tweaking and enhancing their performance, which we know because they're developing. As familiar with the big game ransomware groups, and we know that they are pretty much all now moving towards data exfiltration prior to encryption. This isn't just a handful of files. They're exfiltrating significant amounts of data really to force the hands and make sure they're including PII, PHI data within there, which causes an absolute nightmare for the legal teams, for the victims as well, coupled with the substantial extortion requests which are on the end. So they're really trying to engage with the victims and not just say, you need to pay a significant fund to us. You could also potentially negotiate with those organizations, but that's a whole different ballgame of to pay or not to pay. And that's really going to depend on the type of data that's been exfiltrated, whether you've been able to back up and restore your systems and get back up to an operational state. That's really a decision for your stakeholders and executive teams based on a variety of information. So they need to be kept in the loop with the latest up-to-date developments of the investigation as the ransomware evolves. So what do we know a bit more about Nephilim? So when we look at the kind of MITRE ATT&CK framework, if you like, unlike competitors, Nephilim group tend to take their time in assessing the network and security architecture of their victims. So often it's the case that they may even know the environment better than your own system administrators at the end of it, purely based on the reconnaissance missions and domain discovery that they carry out. So often it's the case that they will tend to utilize living off the land mechanisms, and they'll remain within your environment from the initial compromise, even all the way through up to the 3 to 6 week period carrying out discovery. This really depends on the type of environment, but we know that from past experience with other ransomware groups, the likes of Riot, they do not tend to hang around with the deployment of the ransomware, but we know the likes of Nephilim, it's more of an active human adversary that's deploying the ransomware and taking their time in mapping out the environment. So the reconnaissance missions are really the stage where if you're being proactive in your environment and you're threat hunting for these threats and looking for IOCs associated to this group, that you could potentially identify their footprint. It is fairly difficult because they tend to utilize living off the land, but they do introduce some more third-party tools, as we'll learn about later on. But we really need to be proactive around this discovery phase in detecting their footprint. As with all ransomwares, they will drop notes onto the system. We've seen with the likes of eGregor that they're now starting to print out notes, which is a fairly new tactic and pretty effective. Nephilim follows suit just with, kind of standard ransomware groups in depositing the same notes everywhere and enticing the victims to either utilize their chat on Tor to engage with the actors, or, the common email types of the likes of ProtonMail and Tutanota are seen as secure email communication to communicate with the threat actors and engage in a negotiation. It is important to note, though, that as soon as you start engaging with this actor, then they will start to pile on more pressure with you, and it's likely, and we've seen on engagements and with other scenarios, that they will tend to start to release a handful of your data or proof that they have collected some of your data onto their dark web page to indicate, that they're not messing around, and they will likely release your data in stages if you do not comply with their requests. So the clock effectively starts ticking as soon as you have been, subject to the ransomware attack, but as soon as you also start engaging with the actor. So you really need to consider, if you are going to engage, at what time and what exactly for. So what do we know about the current attack vectors associated to the group? Obviously, commonly used is around Windows Remote Desktop Services, exposed RDP ports coming in on 3389. These are often subject to brute force attacks, or also compromised credentials where they've purchased credentials from other organized crime groups. We suspect that additional vulnerabilities associated to Windows RDP are also probed, albeit we've not specifically seen this on the Nephilim engagements that we've done. However, the CVE codes that you can see depicted are the likely targets for this. We know that they have also been exploiting Citrix application gateways in order to gain access and carry out remote code execution onto victims' infrastructure. And one of the most dominant ones that we've been seeing in our incident response engagements is the likes of IcedID banking Trojan being used to drop the common Cobalt Strike framework, which then provides a secondary stage of actions, which we will touch more on shortly. So IcedID is a pretty significant malware Trojan that we've been seeing on the engagements. So what do we know about the likes of IcedID? So slightly moving away from Nephilim, but this is still fairly aligned based on the TTPs we've seen. So we know that IcedID is distributed by TA551. It's a pretty significant banking Trojan aimed at stealing financial related information, but we've got a moderate confidence of the collaboration between TA551 and Nephilim based on engagements that we've seen in terms of reactive engagements, but also managed security services where we've detected the activities of these groups and prevented them from materializing into the ransomware, which, that provided us a pretty good insight into exactly how they operated, how they performed discovery, which offers up the opportunities of, proactively hunting the activities that they take. So this is pretty much an overview of the most dominant IcedID campaigns towards the latter part of last year. The templates were being distributed primarily in English, but we also know that they were tailored with German and Japanese languages as well. And the mouse spam emails are pretty straightforward. And, you know, to the common user, if obviously from a securities perspective, users, you know, would be enticed into accessing the documents that are attached. However, obviously security professionals would probably see them as a bit more wary. We know that also in the past, the operator of IcedID TA551 have been prolific in distributing other malware such as Valek, but they've moved more away from that and into the IcedID framework. And they haven't just been targeting official work emails, but also personal emails of employees, which may log into their personal email accounts on company assets. And then that provides, you know, a new route for the initial infection vector. So Nephilim ransomware then. So based on the engagements that we've seen initial access via phishing emails coming in with password protected zip files. Those zip files pretty much contain Word documents with malicious macros enabled. So as soon as those Word documents, it's a common story, are accessed by the users, then it'll effectively reach out to a delivery URL, which drops a first stage payload, and then that will then communicate and drop a secondary stage payload of a DLL file. This communicates the command and control for IcedID and drops the IcedID payload packages, which we'll see shortly. As mentioned, the emails are pretty self-explanatory. This is an example of one that we also came across where it's a case of here's an attached document, enter a password, access the Word document, which is pretty much full of junk, and unbeknownst to the user, a script is executed in the background. So the Word documents and the macros themselves have also been obfuscated by the attackers, obviously to try and avoid detection of the malicious macros themselves. So we know that they're utilizing obfuscated Visual Basic code, and that's common amongst most of the IcedID mouse spam that we've analyzed. A breakdown of one of these obfuscated codes leads us to references of file names and other obfuscated values, you know, and references to common Windows binaries as well. So these are effectively indicators for how the delivery URL is configured here. So if we were to look at this example of a document relating to dictate Word document, we can see some Visual Basic references. Here we're pretty much just breaking down the document that Ollie dumped from Remnux malware static reverse engineering. And we can see here that we've got some suspicious char code, which appears to have been obfuscated. If we do break down the Visual Basic code more, we can also see references to char code, but also in addition to that, XOR encoding as well. So this gives us an idea of, you know, this is looking pretty suspicious to us, and it also gives us an idea of the exact encodings for the Visual Basic code. Utilizing, you know, scripts that we've written or common open source tools such as the likes of CyberChef, which is an awesome, you know, encoding and decoding platform. So highly advised to go and look at that. Developed obviously by the likes of GCHQ. Charcode base 10 is utilized along with exclusive or decimal 32 encryption key here. So this is how we can pretty much break down that, revealing the delivery URL for the IcedID mail package. So once IcedID is dropped, we look at the execution, and IcedID utilizes various different binaries depending on the versions of the malware. So we know that the malware will also drop additional binary files, and these often have a PNG extension, but are not obviously picture files, and these tend to get created on the patient zero system. The files themselves are encrypted and packed to payload, and in terms of persistence around them, it tends to modify the registry for auto run and also utilize scheduled tasks to maintain persistence. What we know from the malware itself, as we look more into the PNGs, that the PNGs contain the packed code for the malware. Once the main module of the malware is executed, the PNGs are leveraged and decrypted and injected into memory when IcedID is executed. So if you do come across various different PNGs, often they do drop the same payload multiple times just with different file names, but you can identify them all from the same hash value itself, then you know there's remnants of the payloads being utilized by IcedID. In terms of command and control, as I already mentioned earlier, we've seen on engagements of the likes of IcedID dropping Cobalt Strike beacons. These aren't just binaries onto the system itself, but also into memory buffer as well. We've seen that the beacons are typically deployed between 1 to 2 hours of initial infection of IcedID up to 2 days. So it's a pretty swift operation. They don't tend to hang around initially in the initial infection vector to establish command and control over the assets. And this is typically on patient 0, but later on it tends to get rolled out onto key servers within the infrastructure of operational relevance. So when we look at the likes of Cobalt Strike, you can pretty much identify Cobalt Strike being created in memory within, if you start looking or threat hunting or ingest to monitor your Windows event logs, so the likes of Windows PowerShell, but also in common places we see on the disks of not just patient 0, but also the servers, so the likes of users app data directories, and other common locations with temporary directories. And these are pretty much just in terms of naming conventions. The attacker, as we see, as we heard in the previous presentation, they will align the file naming conventions to the organizations, or in this case, just naming it Windows and Windows Update, which is going to throw off a lot of people. So what do we know about privilege escalation? So, they'll pretty much utilize common tactics that we've seen, but something that we also did come across is an additional vulnerability relating to the background transfer service, or BITS as it's known, for elevation of local privileges. So we've seen this on some engagements where they will utilize an additional payload in order to decompress and code inject specific commands, which will then give them some privilege escalation specifically to this vulnerability. Once they've executed that escalation of privileges, we see common commands being run to add additional groups to the systems, as well as accounts, which they can then leverage. And you can see effectively here in this example, we did actually see a reference to cool hacker being added, as well as persistence with a binary, which you can see there, update 64, which is also being used for command and control and persistence. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the MITRE attack framework, we know that they are primarily utilizing living off the land for performing their domain discovery. We've also seen the likes of some additional third-party tools being introduced onto systems. What we have seen, which is pretty much aligned on all incidents, is as soon as the initial infection vector of IcedID is created, the Cobalt Strike beacons are created, and then the attacker will drop 2 external executables onto the system, which is the likes of AD-Find and 7-exe, which is 7-zip. So we know AD-Find is typically used by a majority of various different threat actors, all the way through to APTs, for retrieving data from active directories. And what they'll typically do is run 5 or 6 different commands against the active directories, dump the results out to a CSV file, compress them with 7-zip, and then exfiltrate them. That then will give them time offline to review information about the active directory and the domain itself, and this is typically carried out offline. But what we see is, AD-Find and 7-exe is always dropped at the same time within a matter of seconds of each other on patient 0. And this is where the significant domain discovery is then carried out using additional tools already built into the system, with the likes of PowerShell and NL test, etc. So we need to really be monitoring and proactively hunting for legitimate services. And a lot of these will be used by your, system admins, etc. And you may return, loads of hits for this, but we need to be a bit more careful in how we tailor the threat hunting for these tools, looking at role-based access control, who needs to utilize these tools, etc. So some of the common commands that I'm sure you've pretty much seen in stuff that we've seen associated to this group are depicted at the moment on the screen. And this is typical of code that we see executed by this group. Often the code is executed in plain text. However, we've also seen the more intrusive commands are the likes of get net firewall rules and also domain file servers. So they'll utilize PowerShell to try and identify file servers, and we all know that that's potentially to assist with the data exfiltration and discovery of where your crown jewels are protected. And the obfuscation is typically a single layer of base 64 encoding. So these are the common commands that we tend to see. So this is the sort of stuff that we need to obviously be looking at. If we see, standard hosts executing, commands for discovery of enterprise administrators and domain administrators, then these are all red flags, which would typically, we'd be looking for within the likes of EDR solution, and also looking at log files themselves as well. So what do we know about credential access? Well, obviously, pretty much what we see day to day is the likes of legitimate tools such as Mimikatz being utilized to credential harvest. And in this case, what we tend to see is actually the attacker modifying the registry, especially around wdigest. So we see that the registry is altered to cache credentials in memory in preparation for the credential theft phase. So the legacy authentication is typically left enabled, we know, on any operating systems prior to Windows Server 2012. And typically, once this is enabled, LSAS will retain a copy of the user's plain text password within memory. So they will alter the registry, leave it for a few hours. Typically, a system admin will come along, enter their credentials. These become cached in memory. Then they can utilize their tools such as Mimikatz to go and grab those plain text credentials. And then there you have it. They then got access to some of the admin credentials. So pretty self-explanatory, but we know that often historical servers or legacy systems prior to 2012, this registry is overlooked. So once those plain text credentials are in memory, as mentioned, we know they execute some obfuscated code as well, and this is pretty much to invoke the likes of Mimikatz to go and read those plain text credentials. So when they're within your environment, in terms of lateral movement, to try and blend in obviously with legitimate activity, it's typically performed with the likes of Windows Remote Desktop Protocol, utilizing credentials that they've harvested for a select few domain admin accounts. So they'll only tend to utilize a few of those to obviously try and blend into the legitimate activities, but you will tend to see a peak within the logs of usage. And we also know from engagements that they are heavily leveraging the likes of admin shares in order to deploy additional Cobalt Strike beacons. And these are typically, they tend to move more from injecting them into memory, but more to the actual Cobalt Strike binary beacons themselves, host them on admin shares and distribute those onto strategically important servers such as file shares and domain controllers throughout your environment, which they know will then give them access to the relevant data, etc. What do we know about defense evasion? Well, we've seen evidence around them interacting with processes to try and kill specific processes associated to EDR solutions. But what we've also seen from monitoring logs, the likes of utilizing PowerShell in order to disable standard antivirus, all the way down to the likes of, historically Windows Defender, which remains in situ on most systems, and often is the case, it's not turned off. So what we do find on a lot of engagements is with the likes of Windows Defender will actually protect some clients more than other solutions which are currently in place. But attackers are, familiar that this comes packaged as default on systems, so they will tend to go and disable that with the likes of Windows PowerShell. As we move towards the latter stage of the activities performed by the actor, they shift their focus pretty much on, okay, so where are the crown jewels being stored? So they've carried out potentially days or weeks of reconnaissance. They've been in your network undetected. By utilizing their discovery commands, they've now identified where your key file servers are being stored. Where are you storing, the sensitive data that you don't want them to get to, that they're wanting to get to. The exfiltration is typically carried out by utilizing legitimate service or cloud hosting service, the likes of Megasync, which are based, I believe, in New Zealand. And we've seen a couple of instances where either they will drop a mega sync binary onto the system to then utilize that to exfiltrate and sync data across, or alternatively, they will typically just utilize a web browser and then access the relevant account and then upload mass amounts of data. We know that prior to that upload, they will tend to compress the data with the likes of WinRAR, and when the data's been encrypted and exfiltrated, they will then go and delete the data. So you can still potentially recover the data from systems if it obviously hasn't been fragmented and partly overwritten. But there is opportunities here around if you start reviewing and monitoring your data flow, of looking at the peaks in traffic of when significant amounts of data is being fired out, and typically they will tend to collate data on a single server or a single file server and exfiltrate it straight from there using common web protocols. So in terms of the ransomware impact itself, then we know that the actor tends to utilize common tools the likes of PsExec in order to distribute and execute the ransomware binary itself, and they will couple this with scripts which will effectively pass commands to PsExec on how to the relevant domain admin credentials or enterprise admin credentials that are required to distribute the ransomware and execute it. So you'll often find traces of the scripts that have been utilized by the attacker, along with the likes of PsExec. So again, utilizing legitimate tools here, which you can be monitoring in order to detect abnormal activity within the environment. So the ransomware binary itself pretty much is aligned to majority of the other ransomwares that we've looked at. The use of VSS admin to remove volume shadow copies, etc. The ransomware is typically file-based encryption, so it's not encrypting whole disks. It is looking for specific files. It tends to avoid operating system files, obviously, to enable users to still at least get onto systems and view ransom notes, etc. But it's a file-based encryption, which does take a fair amount of time to encrypt files. So if you're being subject to the ransomware, you may start to see the notes appearing, but there may still be a short window of opportunity to kill the relevant processes and prevent all files from being encrypted, especially if this is on key servers such as file servers and domain controllers, etc. There is a short window in order to kill the process. But really, this is where we need to be focusing on utilizing EDR solutions, etc., in order to detect this behavior. Some of the additional odd observations that we've seen for this ransomware binary is it will also look at trying to modify some of the MFT attributes to files. So we often see that last modified or written times to files stored on systems are altered. So the timestamps will be changed, which is an odd observation. And also, in addition to that, we've also seen cases where file sizes for files which are being stored on systems are also being altered. We're not entirely sure why this is carried out, but it's just an observation that we've come across. The binary files themselves, typically, they aren't packed. The file names are random, and there's nothing else inside them that kind of makes network connections, etc. We know that this is typically distributed by an active human adversary. But as per before, we have a moderate confidence of the collaboration between TA551 and Nephilim. So it's a case of we know that we're pretty confident with the initial infection vector of TA551 with IcedID and introducing Cobalt. But whether this second stage is being carried out by the same actor or introduced and handed over to a second actor, we still do not have enough evidence to suggest exactly what the case is there. So, as with majority of ransomwares, there's various kind of mitigation and stuff that can be done to try and avoid becoming a victim, but also what can be done if they are in your environment to detect the activities. So, the common things that we tend to come across is completely flat networks which haven't been segregated. One of the big ones is around obviously patching vulnerabilities and zero-day exploits that exist on systems. Having that patch management program will save you, with the majority of your incidents that you come across, and also improve your security posture. Role-based access control will really help limit the usage of accounts by the threat actors, and typically how far they can get utilizing specific tools, accessing specific applications and services that are installed within your environment. If you are, which I hope, ingesting, log files and stuff into a SIEM, and this could be anything from IDS, IPS systems all the way through to AV and EDR, etc., then make sure you're leveraging the kind of latest machine learning and threat intelligence and applying that to the data. Not, kind of gone are the days of just looking at, indicators of compromise, the likes of bad reputation, IP addresses, hash values, etc. The malware's operating in memory now. It's not always leaving traces on disk, so you need to be utilizing machine learning, threat intelligence, assessing what you're seeing against the MITRE attack framework, etc., to identify the relevant TTPs. Monitoring the network traffic will really assist, and also data flow for any potential data exfiltration. So making sure you've also got the likes of relevant DLP processes and systems in place to help with the detection of data exfiltration. There's only so much education of employees that can be carried out. We know that that's probably one of the weakest parts of the environments. Phishing emails aren't going away. It's probably the cause for the likes of 80% of incidents that we see. But trying to narrow down and educate employees as much as you can will always benefit. And last but not least, what we see is making sure the organization has instant response plans in place, because I can tell you from the likes of, if you do have a ransomware incident, you're a global organization having to coordinate multiple different teams and multiple different IT teams and third-party providers. If you don't have relevant communication protocols, escalation criteria, etc. in place, then, you're pretty much going to fall flat on your face before you even get up and running. So making sure you've got that adequate support, and it's really a case of a team game, because you need to make sure that, have you got backups in place? Can you restore those processes? Who's going to do the relevant activities? Can you coordinate that? So it's really a team effort in order to recover from these incidents if you are subject to one, but also if you believe you're currently identifying relevant TTPs within your environment, which indicate the likes of a ransomware attack such as Nefilim, then you're coordinating with the relevant teams in order to, either intelligently monitor the initial stages, or have a strategy in place for how you're going to remediate and contain that threat in one hit, making sure you have all bases covered. So with that, I hope that's been a beneficial presentation. And if there's any questions, then please feel free to pass those across to Debbie and Ali. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. I think just at the end, we went back to your first slide. So I think we might have missed the last couple of slides on there, but we can always, would it be okay if the slides were available for people we've been asked a question, or?
Yes, of course. Yes. So the slides can be made available at the end of the presentation. That's not a problem at all.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. So yeah, we'll get those out to people. So thank you very much, Dan, for that presentation there. We have been asked, could you share the link for the tool that you mentioned?
Yes, so there's a couple of tools mentioned, the likes of CyberChef for GCHQ. You can pretty much find that on GitHub itself as well. And in terms of also the likes of one tool that we utilize or for quick triaging of static analysis of malware, PE tree as well. So we can share those relevant links as required as well.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. So this is your chance to ask Dan any questions that you have of him. So please feel free to type those in the question pane, because again, there's this second presentation that I've watched today, and that was really, really interesting, Dan. I did wonder partway through, you were talking about sometimes engaging with the attackers and making sure that it was the right time. Do you find that sometimes when you're called in, people have already started engaging with the attackers? Does that happen?
Yeah, so it's really fairly varied, to be honest. Often at the times, we may already be engaged with a customer in terms of maybe an MSS client, or it could be, a completely new client that we haven't worked with before, where they've already started a negotiation process with the actors as well. So, you know, to pay or not to pay is really ultimately a decision for the stakeholders of those organisations, but they need to be fed reliable and relevant information as the incident evolves, because within a matter of minutes or hours, the incident could completely change, whether the actor, you know, increases demand or the actor comes back in your environment if you haven't contained the threat that currently exists, etc. So it's important to, you know, make sure that the communication is in place between not just the technical members of the team, but also executive members, and that the relevant communication and information is being passed across between both teams, because often is the case, it's overlooked the case of, you know, typically people see these types of incidents as an IT issue, but it's not an IT issue. All departments are involved, from legal to your marketing department, communication, all the way through to security and IT teams.
Yeah, so it's so important for that engagement internally, isn't it? And with the companies such as yourself. So yeah, that's all incredibly important to make sure that happens. So thank you for answering that one for me. We've had a question come in. So would you recommend that red teams use model ransomware in no holds barred style engagements?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. Typically, we don't tend to see, you know, the likes of red teams looking down the route of ransomware. You know, they're more aimed at, right, let's try and penetrate a network. Once we're in, how far can we get to really demonstrate, you know, weaknesses that are in place, try and avoiding triggering detection systems, etc. I think it would make for an interesting exercise with the likes of ransomware, but obviously red teaming is, you know, trying to limit the impact of the business as well, because the last thing you'd want to do is, you know, take down some systems that is obviously against what you're trying to do there. So I think in due course it would be interesting to try and, you know, come up with a new strategy of how can you really test out a ransomware scenario in the environment where you've obviously got the likes of tabletop exercises, but these are more kind of aimed at assessing, you know, incident response plans, runbooks and things, and identifying weaknesses in the procedures that way. But in terms of red teams, yeah, I think it'd make for an interesting engagement for trying to deploy some files which, you know, could potentially encrypt systems. Not, you know, maybe you can move away from encrypting systems, but actually creating additional binaries which indicate that you've been hit. But you know, that's something that I think would need to be more looked into, of how exactly you would prepare for that scenario.
Excellent, thank you very much, Dan. And on that note, we have near the end of the presentation time. So thank you very much to Dan for today, and I will pass over to him to just say a few last words. And thank you to everybody that has attended this webinar today, and hope you found it incredibly interesting, as have I. And we will make sure that the slides and any information is available afterwards. If you do have any burning questions that you suddenly think of afterwards, then please feel free to pop them through to us at marketing, and we will pass them over to Dan to see if he can get back to you on those ones. So thank you. So I'll pass over to you, Dan, for just the last few words.
Yeah, so yeah, thanks for your time this morning. I hope you found it interesting. Feel free to reach out should you have any queries or other experiences relating to the groups yourself, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day with the CREST workshop.
Lovely, thank you very much. And yes, please feel free. Some of you may have already registered, but our next presentation will be at 10:15, so please feel free to come on to that one. So thank you very much, Dan, and thank you to everybody for attending, and have a good rest of the day. Take care. Bye.